The candle went out the moment the door creaked open, and Eleanor froze with her back against the cold stone wall of the library, her heart hammering so loud she was sure it could be heard through the whole house. A shape moved in the dark. She knew it before he spoke. It was Julian, and if his mother found them here together at this hour, everything would end before it had even begun. "Don't move," he whispered, his hand finding hers in the blackness. "She will pass. She always checks this hallway last." Eleanor pressed her lips together and said nothing, though her whole body trembled. She was 14 years old and already learning the first hard lesson of her life, that loving someone above her station was a secret that could ruin her, and that she would keep it anyway, because some things could not be helped. Footsteps passed on the other side of the door. A pause. Then they faded, and the house settled back into silence. Julian let out a breath and released her hand, though neither of them moved for a long moment, as if letting go too quickly would break something neither of them could yet name. That was how it began, though neither of them understood it then. It would take years before either one dared call it love, and even longer before either one dared say the word aloud. Eleanor had come to Brantmere Hall 3 years earlier, when she was 11, after her father died suddenly of a fever that swept through the estate one bitter winter. Her father had served as steward to the old Duke for 20 years, a man of quiet dignity, who had earned the family's respect, if not their equal regard. When he died, the old Duke, out of some mixture of guilt and kindness, offered Eleanor and her mother a place at the hall. Her mother would help manage the household linens and stores. Eleanor, being clever and well-mannered despite her low birth, would be raised alongside the Duke's own children as a kind of companion, close enough to share lessons, never close enough to forget her place. It was Julian, who had first found her crying behind the stable on her second day at the hall, homesick and afraid, certain she did not belong. He was 12 then, already carrying the seriousness that came from knowing he would one day be Duke, but there was still enough boy left in him to sit down in the dirt beside her without caring about his fine clothes. "You don't have to be afraid of this place," he told her. "It's only frightening until you know where everything is. I'll show you." And he did. Over the following weeks, he showed her the best hiding places in the orchard, the crooked step on the back stairs that creaked louder than any other, the exact spot in the library where sunlight fell in the afternoon, and made even the oldest books look golden. Eleanor, who had lost her father and her home in the same season, found in Julian something steady to hold on to, and she held on with the whole of her young heart, though she would not have called it that at the time. She would only have said he was her friend, her first and truest friend, in a house full of strangers. As the years passed, their friendship deepened in ways that neither the household nor the family seemed to notice, or perhaps chose not to notice, since it was common enough for children of different stations to be close before the world demanded they separate. They read the same books and argued over which endings were better. They rode together when no one was watching, Eleanor perched awkwardly behind him on his horse, because she had never been taught to ride her own. They talked, endlessly, about everything and nothing, the way only very young people can, before the weight of the world teaches them to guard their words. It was on a summer evening, not long after the night in the library, that Eleanor first understood her feelings had changed into something she could not simply call friendship anymore. Julian had been thrown from his horse while racing one of the stable boys, and though he was unharmed but for a bruised arm, Eleanor had run the entire distance from the house to the field when she heard the shouting, certain in her heart that he was dying, that she could not breathe, until she saw with her own eyes that he was whole. When she reached him and found him laughing, brushing dirt from his coat and insisting he was perfectly fine, the relief that flooded through her was so overwhelming that she had to turn away to hide the tears in her eyes. Julian caught her arm. "Eleanor, what's wrong?" "Nothing," she said, though her voice shook. "I thought you were hurt." He looked at her for a long moment, something shifting behind his eyes, though he was too young, or too unpracticed, to understand what he saw in her face. "I'm not so easily broken," he said softly, and something in the way he said it made her heart ache in a way she did not yet have words for. She was 15 that summer. She did not sleep well for weeks afterward, turning the moment over and over in her mind, trying to decide what it meant, and slowly, painfully, coming to understand that what she felt for Julian was no longer the simple loyalty of childhood friendship. it had become something far more dangerous. She loved him. She loved him the way the songs described, the way the novels in the library described, with an ache that lived in her chest and would not leave no matter how she tried to reason it away. She told no one, not her mother, who worked long hours below stairs and would only have warned her of the foolishness of such feelings. Not Julian's sister, who was kind but far too young to be trusted with such a secret. Certainly not Julian himself, who she was certain would never look at her the same way again if he knew the truth, or worse, would look at her with pity, which she thought she could not bear. Her mother, in fact, seemed to sense something before Eleanor ever said a word. One evening, as they folded linens together by candlelight, her mother spoke, without looking up from her work. "You spend a great deal of time with the young master. He is kind to me," Eleanor said carefully. "Kindness is easy for those who lose nothing by it," her mother said, and there was no cruelty in her voice, only a weariness that came from having lived long enough to understand the world as it truly was. "He is the future Duke, Eleanor. Whatever kindness he shows you now, it will not follow either of you into the lives you are meant to lead. You would do well to remember that, before your heart forgets it for you." Eleanor said nothing, because there was nothing to say. Her mother was not wrong. She knew, even at 15, that the world she lived in had rules that did not bend for feelings, however true they might be. A steward's daughter did not marry a duke. She might, if fortune favored her, marry a clerk, or a merchant, or perhaps, if she were very lucky, a gentleman of modest means, who did not mind that her family had once served, rather than been served, but never a duke, never Julian. And so she buried the feeling, as deep as she could, the way one buries something precious in the ground, not because it deserves to be hidden, but because there is no safe place for it above the surface. She told herself she would grow out of it, the way children grow out of fears of the dark, or fondness for particular toys. She told herself that time would dull the ache, that one day she would look at Julian and feel nothing more than the comfortable warmth of old friendship. She was wrong, though it would take her many more years to fully understand how wrong. The years that followed brought changes, some small, some enormous. Julian was sent away for a time to complete his education, returning during holidays taller, more serious, carrying himself with the particular stillness of someone who has begun to understand the weight that will one day rest on his shoulders. Each time he returned, Eleanor watched him from a careful distance, noting the changes, feeling her heart betray her, over and over, with the same foolish leap of joy, whenever their eyes happened to meet across a room. They still found time to talk, though the ease of their childhood conversations had given way to something more careful, more aware. They no longer raced through the orchard or hid together from the rain. Instead they walked, at a respectable distance, discussing books, or the state of the estate, or whatever news had reached the hall from London. It was a friendship dressed in propriety, and beneath that careful dress, Eleanor's love remained exactly where she had buried it, alive and unspoken, growing quietly stronger with each passing year, rather than weaker, no matter how she tried to will it otherwise. Julian, for his part, gave no sign that he felt anything beyond the natural affection of an old friendship, though there were moments, brief and fleeting, when Eleanor caught him looking at her in a way that made her wonder. A pause before he spoke. A softness in his voice when he said her name. The way he always seemed to know, without being told, when something troubled her. But she told herself these were things she imagined, things her own hopeful heart invented, because it wanted so badly for them to be true. The old Duke, Julian's father, had never been a robust man, and in the autumn of the year, Eleanor turned 18. His health began to fail in earnest. The physicians came and went from Brantmere Hall, with increasing frequency, their faces growing grimmer with each visit, though none of them spoke plainly of what was coming. Julian, now 20, took on more and more of the estate's business, learning at his father's bedside the details of accounts and tenants and obligations that would one day be entirely his own burden to carry. Eleanor watched him change during those months, watched the careless warmth of the boy she had loved since childhood harden into something more guarded, more serious. He no longer had time for long walks or quiet talks in the library. He was needed everywhere at once, and the responsibility seemed to age him faster than the years themselves could have managed. She ached to comfort him, to tell him that she understood the weight he carried, but she no longer knew how to reach him across the widening distance between who he had been and who he was becoming. It was on a gray morning in late November that the old Duke finally passed, quietly, in his sleep, with his family gathered around him. Eleanor was not permitted in the room, of course, being no true member of the family, but she stood in the hallway outside with her mother and the other household staff, and when the door finally opened and Julian emerged, pale and hollow-eyed, something in her chest broke to see him so undone. He looked up, and across the crowded hallway, his eyes found hers, just for a moment, as if she were the only person there who truly understood what he had lost. Then his sister took his arm, and the moment passed, and Eleanor watched him disappear down the corridor to begin the long, heavy work of becoming Duke of Brantmere. She did not know, standing there in that cold hallway, that this was the moment the wall between them truly began to rise, a wall built not out of unkindness but out of duty, out of the terrible weight of a title that would soon demand everything Julian had to give. She only knew that something had shifted, that the boy who had once sat beside her in the dirt behind the stables to comfort a frightened, grieving girl was gone, and in his place stood a man who would need to become someone she was no longer certain she recognized. She did not yet know how many years it would take before that wall came down, or what it would cost either of them before it finally did. She knew only that she loved him, that she had loved him for as long as she could remember loving anything at all, and that whatever came next, she would carry that love quietly, the way she always had, folded away where no one could see it, waiting for a day she did not dare to hope would ever come. The funeral was held on a cold, clear day, the kind of day that seemed almost cruel in its beauty against the family's grief. Eleanor stood far back among the household staff, watching Julian receive the condolences of the county's finest families, his shoulders straight, his face composed, every inch the Duke he had just become. She thought, watching him, that she had never seen anyone look so alone in the middle of so many people. That night, long after the house had gone quiet, she found herself in the library once more, drawn there by memory as much as by any real purpose. She did not expect to find him there, but he was, seated in the dark near the window, still in his mourning clothes, staring out at nothing. "You should be resting," she said softly, not wanting to startle him. "I can't," he said, without turning. "Every time I close my eyes, I hear all the things I still need to do tomorrow, and the day after, and every day after that." She crossed the room and sat, as she had 100 times before, though this time there was a careful space between them that had not existed in their childhood. "You don't have to carry it all at once," she said. "Only one day at a time. That's all anyone can manage." He turned to look at her then, and for a moment, the years and the distance between them seemed to fall away, and he was simply Julian again, tired and grieving, and grateful not to be alone. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for always knowing what to say." Eleanor smiled, though her heart ached with the effort of keeping her feelings hidden. "It's easy," she said. "I've known you a very long time." They sat together in silence for a while longer, and though nothing was said that could not have been said between any two old friends, Eleanor felt, more strongly than she had in years, the terrible unfairness of loving someone she could never have. She left the library before he did, that night, because she did not trust herself to stay any longer without her heart betraying itself in her face. She did not know it then, but this quiet moment of comfort, offered so simply and asked for nothing in return, would become one of the memories she returned to again and again in the long years that followed. A single warm ember she kept alive through everything that was still to come. Julian's first full year as Duke of Brantmere taught him, in ways his father's careful instruction never had, exactly how heavy a title could feel. Debts he had not known existed surfaced in the estate's ledgers. Tenants who had trusted his father's word now watched him with a careful, measuring patience, waiting to see what kind of man had truly inherited the land. Letters arrived daily from London, from solicitors, from distant relations offering advice he had not asked for, and from his mother, the Dowager Duchess, whose letters carried a particular weight of expectation that pressed on him harder than all the rest combined. Eleanor watched these changes from her position within the household, close enough to see the toll it took, too far removed by rank to ever offer real comfort. She had been given more responsibility of her own since the old Duke's passing, assisting Julian's younger sister, Margaret, with her studies and her correspondence, and helping the housekeeper manage the growing demands of a household now under constant scrutiny from every corner of society. It was steady, useful work, and Eleanor threw herself into it with a determination that had as much to do with keeping her mind away from Julian as it did with any real ambition. It did not entirely work. There was no escaping him in a house as full of his presence as Brantmere Hall had become. She saw him at breakfast, distracted and pale from another sleepless night. She saw him in the study, bent over ledgers with an intensity that made him look far older than his 21 years. She saw him, on the rare evenings he allowed himself to rest, standing alone at the window of the drawing room, staring out at the grounds as if searching for something he had lost and could not name. It was on one such evening, in early spring, that Eleanor found herself alone with him for the first time in weeks, both of them having stayed later than the rest of the household to finish separate tasks that had nothing to do with each other, and everything to do, perhaps, with a shared reluctance to be entirely apart. "You've been avoiding the library," Julian said, without turning from the window, when she came in to return a book Margaret had left in his study. Eleanor paused in the doorway. "I didn't think you noticed." "I notice more than you think," he said, finally turning to face her. There was something tired and unguarded in his expression, a rare crack in the composed mask he had learned to wear since becoming Duke. "I've missed our talks." "You've had no time for talks," she said gently. "You've hardly had time to sleep." "That's true." He gave a small, humorless laugh. "But I've missed them all the same." Eleanor's heart lifted, foolishly, dangerously, at the simple honesty in his voice, and she had to remind herself, as she had reminded herself 1,000 times before, that such moments meant nothing more than what they appeared to mean. Old friends, missing old conversations. Nothing more. She could not afford to let herself believe otherwise. "Perhaps you'll have more time, once things have settled," she offered. "Perhaps," he said, though his voice carried little conviction. "My mother believes I should marry soon. She says a duke needs a duchess, that the estate needs the stability of a proper household, that Parliament looks more favorably on married men with settled affairs." He shook his head. "She has a list, Eleanor. An actual list of names, as though I were choosing livestock at a market." Eleanor forced a small smile, though the words landed somewhere painful and deep. "And what does the list say?" "Lady Cordelia Vane is at the top of it," he said. "Her father's estate borders ours to the north. The match would settle a boundary dispute that has cost this family a fortune in legal fees for 3 generations. My mother considers it a masterstroke." "And do you?" Julian was quiet for a long moment, his eyes drifting back toward the window. "I consider it inevitable," he said finally. "Whether I think it a masterstroke or not seems rather beside the point." Eleanor said nothing, because there was nothing she could say that would not betray far more than she dared reveal. She busied herself instead with straightening the books on the shelf nearest her, grateful for the excuse to keep her back to him for a moment, while she composed her face into something that would not give her away. "You're very quiet," Julian observed. "I'm only tired," she said, which was not entirely a lie, though the exhaustion she felt had little to do with the hour. He studied her for a moment, longer than was strictly comfortable, and Eleanor wondered, not for the first time, whether he saw more of her heart than she wished him to. But if he suspected anything, he said nothing of it, and after a moment, the conversation moved on to safer subjects: the state of the eastern fields, a letter from Margaret's tutor, the ordinary business of a great house that gave them both somewhere safe to rest their attention. Lady Cordelia Vane arrived at Brantmere Hall for the first time that summer, accompanying her parents on what was, by all appearances, a purely social visit between neighboring families, though everyone in the household understood its true purpose. Eleanor watched from a distance as Cordelia was welcomed into the drawing room, a tall, graceful young woman with pale gold hair and an easy, confident manner that spoke of a lifetime spent knowing exactly what was expected of her and exactly how to deliver it. There was nothing unkind in Cordelia, Eleanor noted, with a strange mixture of relief and despair. She was not cruel, not vain in any obvious way, not the sort of villain one might have hoped for in order to justify resentment. She was simply a young woman of good family, pleasant and well-mannered, entirely suited by birth and temperament to become Duchess of Brantmere. Watching her converse easily with Julian's mother, laughing at some remark with practiced grace, Eleanor felt the full, crushing weight of how impossible her own feelings truly were. Cordelia belonged in that drawing room in a way Eleanor never could. It was not a matter of who loved Julian more sincerely. It was simply a matter of the world as it was, and the world, Eleanor understood with painful clarity, had already decided. That evening, a small gathering was arranged in honor of the Vane family's visit, a modest dance held in the long gallery, with music provided by a handful of local musicians and refreshments laid out along the walls. Eleanor was not a guest, of course, but she had duties that evening assisting Margaret, who was old enough now to attend such gatherings, but young enough to still need occasional guidance in navigating them. It was during a lull in the dancing, while Margaret had gone to speak with a friend, that Eleanor found herself briefly alone near the edge of the room, and it was there that Julian approached her, having slipped away, it seemed, from the cluster of guests surrounding him and Cordelia. "You look as though you'd rather be anywhere else," he said, a faint smile tugging at his mouth. "I'm simply not accustomed to such grand company," Eleanor said carefully. "Nonsense. You've weathered far grander company than this, without any trouble at all." He glanced toward the dance floor, where the musicians were beginning a new set. "Would you dance with me?" Eleanor's heart nearly stopped. "Julian, I couldn't possibly. Your mother would." "My mother is occupied with Lady Vane," he said, "and one dance between old friends is hardly a scandal." There was something in his eyes, some quiet, stubborn insistence, that made her wonder if he needed this moment as much as she suddenly, desperately wanted it. Against every instinct of caution she had spent years cultivating, Eleanor allowed him to lead her onto the floor as the music began. It was only one dance, entirely proper in its steps, watched by dozens of eyes across the room, and yet to Eleanor, it felt like the most intimate thing that had ever passed between them. His hand at her waist, light and correct, still sent a warmth through her that she was certain must be visible to anyone who looked closely enough. She kept her eyes fixed somewhere near his shoulder, afraid that if she looked directly at him, everything she had spent years hiding would spill out across her face for the whole room to see. "You're not looking at me," Julian said quietly, as they turned through the steps. "I'm concentrating on the dance," she said, which was, again, not entirely a lie. "Eleanor." His voice had dropped low enough that only she could hear it over the music. "Look at me." She did, finally, lifting her eyes to his, and what she saw there nearly undid every careful wall she had spent 9 years building around her heart. There was something raw in his expression, something that looked, for just a moment, like the same helpless ache she carried herself. But before either of them could say anything further, the music ended, and the moment shattered into the ordinary business of bowing and curtsying and stepping apart, the way propriety demanded. Later that night, after the guests had gone and the house had finally settled into quiet, Eleanor slipped out to the garden, needing air, needing space to breathe after an evening that had left her feeling both exposed and more alive than she had in years. She did not expect to find Julian there too, standing near the old stone gate at the edge of the garden, his hands braced against the top of it, staring out at the dark fields beyond. "Couldn't sleep either?" she asked softly, coming to stand a careful distance beside him. "No," he admitted. "Too much on my mind." They stood together in silence for a while, the night air cool and fragrant with the scent of late roses, and Eleanor found herself wondering, with a kind of desperate hope she immediately tried to suppress, whether he might finally say something true, something that would either confirm or destroy everything she had spent years hoping and fearing in equal measure. "Eleanor," he said finally, his voice low and careful, "there are things I think about, sometimes, that I have no right to think." Her breath caught. "Julian, I know what my life is meant to look like," he continued, not quite looking at her. "I know what is expected of me, what I owe to this family, to this estate, to everyone who depends on me to make the right choices. I have known it since the day my father died, and I have tried, every single day since, to be the man that duty requires me to be." He finally turned to look at her, and the raw honesty in his face made her chest ache. "But there are moments, Eleanor, when none of that seems to matter at all, and I don't know what to do with that." Eleanor's heart pounded so hard she was certain he must hear it. Every part of her wanted to close the distance between them, to tell him that she understood exactly what he meant, that she had carried the same impossible weight for 9 long years. But she thought too, of Cordelia in the drawing room, of the boundary dispute and the family's fortunes, of everything that rested on Julian's shoulders, and everything he stood to lose if he let himself want something the world had already decided he could not have. "Duty matters," she said quietly, though the words cost her more than he could ever know. "It has to matter, Julian, for both our sakes." Something in his face closed, then, not with anger, but with a kind of resigned understanding, as though he had expected exactly this answer, and hated it just as much as she did in giving it. He nodded slowly, stepping back from the gate, putting careful distance between them once more. "You're right," he said. "Of course you're right." He walked back toward the house without another word, and Eleanor stood alone at the garden gate for a long time afterward, her heart breaking quietly in the dark, wondering if she had just done the right thing, or the thing that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She did not yet know it would be both. The following 2 years brought Lady Cordelia Vane to Brantmere Hall with increasing regularity, each visit a small, deliberate step in a courtship that everyone understood was less a matter of affection than of arrangement, though it was conducted with all the careful politeness such arrangements required. Eleanor watched it unfold from her position at the edges of every gathering, a witness to a slow procession she had no right to interrupt and no power to stop. She told herself, during those months, that she was grateful for the distance the courtship placed between herself and Julian, that it made her own foolish feelings easier to manage, easier to bury beneath the ordinary business of her days. She was, by then, 20 years old, fully grown into the quiet, capable young woman her mother had raised her to be, respected within the household for her competence and her discretion, trusted with responsibilities well beyond what her station might have suggested. She told herself this was enough, a useful life, a respected place. It did not need to include Julian's heart to be worth living. She was mostly successful in believing this, during the daylight hours, when there was work to occupy her hands and her mind. It was only in quiet moments, unguarded moments, that the old ache returned, sharp and insistent, refusing to be reasoned away no matter how many years passed. The engagement between Julian and Cordelia was announced in the autumn, at a grand dinner attended by both families and half the county's notable persons. Eleanor was present only in her working capacity, overseeing the final arrangements of the table settings, ensuring that Margaret, now old enough to properly attend such occasions, was correctly dressed and prepared. She did not witness the announcement itself, having been called away to the kitchens over some crisis with the second course, and she was, in a strange way, grateful for the excuse to be elsewhere when the words were finally spoken aloud. She heard of it later that evening from one of the other maids, breathless with the excitement of it all, as though the news were the most thrilling event to occur at Brantmere Hall in years. Eleanor smiled and nodded and said all the correct things, and later, alone in the small room she shared with her mother, she allowed herself, finally, to cry, quietly, into her pillow, mourning a possibility she had never truly possessed to begin with, and yet somehow still felt the loss of it, as keenly as if it had been real. Her mother found her there, some time later, and said nothing at first, simply sitting on the edge of the narrow bed and resting a hand on Eleanor's back, the way she had when Eleanor was a small child grieving her father. "I did warn you," her mother said eventually, though there was no triumph in her voice, only a deep, tired sympathy. "I know," Eleanor whispered. "It will hurt for a while," her mother said. "It would be strange if it didn't. But you are young, Eleanor, and you are capable, and this house is not the whole of the world. There is a life waiting for you somewhere, a good life, if you allow yourself to find it." Eleanor did not answer, because she did not yet believe it, though she would, in time, come to understand her mother had been right about more than she knew. The wedding took place the following spring, a grand affair attended by nearly every notable family in the county, the church filled with flowers and finery, reception, afterwards stretching long into the evening, with music and dancing, and the particular giddy celebration that accompanied the joining of two great families. Eleanor attended in her working capacity once more, helping to manage the endless small crises that accompanied such a large event, grateful, again, for the excuse to keep her hands and her mind too busy for grief. She caught only glimpses of Julian throughout the day, resplendent in his wedding clothes, playing his part with the same composed dignity he had learned to wear since becoming Duke. Once, across the crowded churchyard, their eyes met briefly, and something passed between them that Eleanor could not name. Gratitude, perhaps, or apology, or simply the quiet acknowledgement of two people who understood, without needing words, exactly what the day cost them both, though for entirely different reasons. Then the moment passed, swept away by the demands of the occasion, and Eleanor did not allow herself another such glance for the rest of the day. Life at Brantmere Hall settled, in the months that followed, into a new and careful rhythm. Cordelia proved, as Eleanor had suspected she would, a competent and gracious duchess, well liked by the household staff and the tenants alike, capable of managing the domestic affairs of the estate with an ease that spoke of a lifetime's preparation for exactly this role. There was no cruelty in her toward Eleanor, no suspicion, no sense that Cordelia saw in the quiet companion to her new sister-in-law anything more than a useful and trustworthy member of the household. Eleanor was, for the most part, grateful for this. It would have been far harder, she thought, to bear Cordelia's presence if there had been any real unkindness in it. And yet there was, in the marriage itself, a certain quiet distance that Eleanor could not help but notice, though she told herself repeatedly that it was none of her concern to notice it at all. Julian and Cordelia were polite with each other, considerate, dutiful in the ways that mattered to the running of a great household. But there was little warmth between them, little of the easy affection Eleanor remembered from her own childhood friendship with Julian, before duty and title had reshaped him into someone more guarded. They occupied the same house, attended the same gatherings, fulfilled the same obligations, but they seemed, to Eleanor's careful and perhaps too attentive eye, to live almost entirely separate lives beneath the same roof. She told herself this was not her concern. She told herself many things, in those years, most of which she only half believed. Eleanor's own role within the household continued to grow. Margaret, now approaching the age of her own eventual marriage, relied on Eleanor's steady guidance more than ever, and the Dowager Duchess, Julian's mother, whose health had begun a slow decline in the years since her husband's death, came increasingly to depend on Eleanor's quiet, capable presence as well. Eleanor found, in caring for the older woman, a purpose that occupied both her hands and her heart, and if some part of her recognized that staying close to the Dowager Duchess also meant staying close to Brantmere Hall, and therefore close to Julian, she did not allow herself to examine that recognition too closely. 3 years passed in this manner, marked by the ordinary rhythms of a great household, the changing seasons, the small triumphs, and small sorrows of estate life. Eleanor turned 23, then 24, watching from her careful distance as Julian settled further into the role of Duke, his early uncertainty giving way to a quiet, capable authority that earned him increasing respect throughout the county. She told herself, during those years, that her feelings for him had finally begun to fade, worn smooth by time, the way a stone is worn smooth by a river, and for long stretches she almost believed it. It was a small moment, in the 5th year of Julian's marriage, that proved to her how wrong she had been. A sudden storm had swept through the county one autumn afternoon, catching Eleanor and Margaret far from the house on one of their regular walks through the grounds. They took shelter in the old gardener's cottage near the eastern edge of the estate, and it was there, some time later, that Julian found them, having ridden out himself when the storm's severity became clear, worried for his sister's safety. He arrived soaked through, his horse lathered from the hard ride, and the relief on his face when he saw them both safe and unharmed was so plain, so unguarded, that Eleanor felt something in her chest crack open all over again. "You frightened me half to death," he said, striding into the small cottage, his eyes moving first to Margaret, then, lingering a moment longer, to Eleanor. "We're perfectly well," Margaret said, laughing at his dramatic entrance. "Eleanor kept us both quite safe and dry." Julian's eyes stayed on Eleanor a moment longer than was strictly necessary, something unspoken passing across his face, before he seemed to catch himself and looked away. "I'm glad," he said quietly. "I don't know what I would have done, if either of you had come to harm." The words were ordinary enough, the sort of thing any brother, any friend might say. But something in the way he said them, the particular weight he placed on the word either, made Eleanor's heart leap in a way she had spent years training it not to do. She busied herself gathering their things, refusing to meet his eyes again, terrified of what she might see there, or worse, of what he might see in her own. They rode back to the house together as the storm cleared, the three of them mostly silent, and Eleanor spent the entire journey scolding herself internally for allowing a single ordinary sentence to undo years of careful discipline. She told herself, once again, that she had imagined the weight in his voice, that grief and worry could make anyone's words sound heavier than they were intended. She told herself this, and she almost believed it, until that evening, when Julian found a private moment to speak with her, alone in the hallway outside the nursery, where she had gone to check on Margaret's youngest cousin, visiting for the season. "Eleanor," he said, his voice low, "I want to thank you properly. For today. For always keeping her safe. For keeping this whole family steady, in ways I don't think any of us properly acknowledge." "It's no more than my duty," Eleanor said carefully. "It's more than duty," Julian said, and there was something in his eyes, some old, familiar ache, that told her he was not entirely speaking of Margaret anymore. "It has always been more than duty, hasn't it, for both of us?" Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. 9 years of careful silence rose up in her chest, pressing against her ribs, desperate for release. She thought of Cordelia, somewhere in the house, his wife, his duchess, the woman who had every right to whatever truth Julian might be tempted to speak in this quiet hallway. She thought of everything she had spent 9 years protecting, his honor, her own dignity, the fragile peace of a household that depended on everyone playing their proper part. "Julian," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "we cannot do this." He closed his eyes briefly, as though her words had cost him something physical. "I know," he said. "I know we cannot. I only needed, once, to say it aloud, that it has always been more than duty." He left her standing alone in the hallway, and Eleanor pressed her hand against the wall to steady herself, her heart pounding with a mixture of joy and grief, so tangled together, she could no longer tell one from the other. She had waited 9 years for some acknowledgement of what lived between them, and now that she had it, she understood, with a clarity that felt almost cruel, that having it changed nothing at all. He was still married. She was still nothing more than a companion in his household. The truth, once spoken, only made the impossibility of their situation more painful to bear, not less. She did not sleep that night, turning his words over and over in her mind, wondering what, if anything, they were meant to change, and slowly coming to understand that they were meant to change nothing. That they had been spoken precisely because nothing could ever come of them. A single honest confession offered, and then folded away again, the way she had folded away her own heart 9 years earlier, in a dark library. Certain even then that some loves are meant only to be carried quietly, never spoken, never acted upon, simply endured. The years that followed Julian's quiet confession in the hallway passed with a strange, aching stillness, as though both he and Eleanor had silently agreed, without ever discussing it, to retreat further behind the careful walls of propriety they had spent so long building. They spoke less often, and when they did speak, their conversations stayed carefully within the safe boundaries of estate business, family news, the ordinary matters that required no risk of the heart at all. Eleanor told herself this distance was for the best, that it was, perhaps, the only mercy either of them could offer the other, and yet there were nights she lay awake missing him, with an intensity that frightened her, missing not the duke he had become, but the boy who had once sat beside her in the dirt behind the stables, simply to keep a grieving child company. The Dowager Duchess's health continued its slow decline through those years, and Eleanor's role in caring for her grew accordingly, until she had become, in all but name, the older woman's most trusted companion, present at her bedside more often than any member of the family, reading to her in the long afternoons, sitting quietly with her through the difficult nights when sleep would not come easily. It was work Eleanor did not resent, work that gave her purpose, and, in its own quiet way, kept her tethered to Brantmere Hall, in a manner she did not examine too closely, though her mother, watching her daughter's devotion to the old woman, sometimes wondered aloud whether Eleanor was caring for the Dowager Duchess, or simply finding one more reason to remain close to a house she could never fully leave behind. Cordelia, in those same years, grew into her role as Duchess with an increasing quiet reserve that Eleanor could not help but notice, though she was careful never to remark upon it to anyone. There were no children born of the marriage, a fact that weighed visibly on Cordelia as the years passed. though it was never spoken of openly within the household. Whatever private grief this absence caused, Cordelia carried it with the same composed dignity she carried everything else. And if the distance between herself and Julian widened, rather than narrowed with each passing season, she gave no outward sign of complaint. It was in the 7th year of Julian's marriage that Eleanor first noticed Cordelia watching her with an expression she could not quite interpret, a careful, measuring look that appeared occasionally across a dinner table or a drawing room, gone almost as quickly as it arrived, leaving Eleanor uncertain whether she had imagined it at all. She told herself it meant nothing, that she was simply growing overly cautious in her old habit of watching Julian for signs of feelings he could never properly express, and that this caution had begun, perhaps, to make her imagine similar watchfulness in others where none truly existed. She was wrong about this, as she would soon learn. It happened on a quiet afternoon in early winter, when Eleanor had gone to the small sitting room adjoining the Dowager Duchess's chambers to fetch a particular book the older woman had requested. She did not expect to find Cordelia there, seated alone, near the window, and for a moment both women simply regarded each other in a silence that felt heavier than the room could easily hold. "Please, sit with me a moment, Eleanor," Cordelia said finally, her voice calm, though there was something careful in the way she said it, something that made Eleanor's heart begin to beat a little faster. Eleanor sat, uncertain, folding her hands carefully in her lap. "Is something troubling you, Your Grace?" Cordelia was quiet for a long moment, studying Eleanor with the same measuring expression Eleanor had noticed before, though now, at close range, there was nothing unkind in it, only a tired, resigned honesty that seemed to have been building for years, waiting for exactly this private moment to finally surface. "I have known for some time," Cordelia said at last, "that my husband's heart has never fully belonged to me." Eleanor's breath caught, panic rising sharp and sudden in her chest. "Your Grace, I don't know what you mean." "Please," Cordelia said, gently but firmly, "don't insult either of us by pretending. I have watched the two of you for years, Eleanor. I have watched the way he looks at you when he believes no one is paying attention, the way his voice softens, ever so slightly, whenever your name comes into a conversation. I am not a foolish woman, and I have had a great many quiet years in this house, to observe what others, perhaps, were too kind or too discreet to point out to me directly." Eleanor felt tears rising, hot and humiliating, and she pressed her hands together tightly to keep them from trembling. "I have never," she said, her voice unsteady, "acted improperly. Not once, in all these years. Whatever you may have observed, I swear to you, Your Grace, I have never sought to—" "I know," Cordelia interrupted, not unkindly. "That is precisely why I have never spoken of it before now. Whatever exists between you and my husband, you have both carried it with more restraint and more honor than most people in your position would have managed. I do not say this to accuse you, Eleanor. I say it because I think, after all these years, someone ought to acknowledge the truth plainly, if only once." Eleanor could not speak for a long moment, overwhelmed by a confusing tide of shame and relief and grief all at once. "I am so sorry," she finally managed, "for whatever pain this has caused you. I never wished to cause you any harm." "I believe you," Cordelia said, and there was a weariness in her voice that spoke of years of quiet, private sorrow, borne alone, without complaint. "Ours was never a marriage built on love, Eleanor. We both understood that from the beginning. It was built on land and duty, and the practical needs of two great families. I do not fault Julian for a heart he could not choose, and I do not fault you for loving him, since it seems clear enough you never once acted to steal what was never truly mine to begin with." She turned to look out the window, her expression distant. "I only wonder, sometimes, what might have become of all three of us, if the world had allowed any of us to choose more freely." Eleanor had no answer for this, and the two women sat together in a strange, sad silence for a while longer, until Cordelia finally rose, smoothing her skirts with practiced composure, the mask of Duchess sliding back into place as though the conversation had never happened at all. "I would ask only one thing of you," Cordelia said, pausing at the door. "Whatever comes, in whatever years remain to any of us, please do nothing that would bring true scandal upon this family. Julian has worked too hard, for too many years, to see his name and his household damaged now. You have my word. Eleanor said quietly, and Cordelia nodded once before leaving the room, taking with her a secret that had, in the speaking, somehow become lighter for them both. The crisis that finally broke through 9 years of careful restraint arrived not gradually, as Eleanor might have expected, but suddenly, in the depths of a bitter winter, when the Dowager Duchess, whose health had been failing slowly for years, took a sharp and unexpected turn for the worse. The physicians were called at once, their faces grave, and the entire household settled into the particular hushed tension that accompanies a death everyone can feel approaching, but no one is yet ready to name aloud. Eleanor stayed at the older woman's bedside through the worst of it, exhausted but unwilling to leave, reading softly to her through the long nights when sleep would not come, holding her hand through the difficult hours when pain made rest impossible. Julian, too, kept a near constant vigil, and it was inevitable, in the small hours of those long nights, that he and Eleanor found themselves alone together, more often than they had allowed themselves to be in years, both of them too exhausted, too raw with grief, to maintain the careful distance they had spent so long building. It was on the fourth night, when the physicians finally admitted there was nothing more to be done, that the Dowager Duchess slipped quietly away in her sleep, with Julian and Eleanor both at her bedside, her hand resting between both of theirs in the last quiet moments before the end. The grief that followed was profound, and in its rawness, something in Julian finally cracked that 9 years of duty had never quite managed to fully seal shut. He found Eleanor alone in the garden the night after the funeral, standing near the old stone gate where he had once told her, so many years before, that some things mattered more than duty, and this time, when he spoke, there was no careful restraint left in his voice at all. "I have spent 9 years telling myself that loving you quietly, from a proper distance, was enough," he said, his voice breaking with an emotion he no longer had the strength to hide. "That if I never spoke it aloud, never acted upon it, I could keep my honor intact, keep this family safe, keep everyone I love from being hurt by my own selfish heart. But I don't know how much longer I can keep telling myself that, Eleanor. Not after tonight. Not after watching the last person who ever truly understood what this feeling costs me leave this world without my ever having the courage to simply say it plainly, even once, to the one person who has always deserved to hear it." Eleanor's tears fell freely now. 9 years of careful restraint, finally overwhelmed by grief and exhaustion, and a longing she could no longer pretend not to feel. "Julian, please, not tonight. Not like this." "Then when?" he asked, his voice raw. "When has there ever been a right time, in 9 years? Tell me, and I will wait for it." "But I don't think such a time is coming, Eleanor. I think we have simply been waiting for permission that will never arrive." She wanted, more than she had ever wanted anything, to close the distance between them, to finally let 9 years of careful silence give way to the truth they had both spent so long protecting everyone else from. But even in her grief, even in the raw honesty of that terrible, beautiful night, Eleanor understood something Julian, in his exhaustion, could not yet see clearly. Whatever they said to each other in the garden that night would not undo the fact that he was still married, still bound by duty to a household, and a name that depended on his honor remaining intact. Whatever comfort they found in each other now would only make the years that followed harder to bear, for all three of them, Cordelia included, who had asked for only one thing, and asked it with more grace than either of them had any right to expect. "I love you," Eleanor said finally, the words she had carried silently for 9 years, spoken aloud at last, though her voice broke with the effort of saying them, even as she prepared to do the hardest thing she had ever done. "I have loved you since I was 14 years old, hiding with you in the dark, terrified of being discovered. I will love you, I think, for the rest of my life, whatever becomes of either of us. But I cannot let that love be the thing that finally breaks everything you have spent your whole life protecting. I love you too much to let it destroy you, Julian, even if loving you quietly is the hardest thing I have ever done." Julian said nothing for a long moment, his face etched with a grief that went far beyond the loss of his mother, and Eleanor understood, watching him, that she had just made the decision that both of them had spent 9 years avoiding, and that nothing between them would ever be quite the same again. "Then what do we do?" he asked finally, his voice hollow. Eleanor did not yet have an answer, but standing there in the cold garden, with 9 years of buried love finally spoken aloud between them, she understood, with a terrible clarity, that something had to change, that the careful silence they had both maintained for so long could not continue indefinitely, not now that the truth had finally been given voice. She did not know, that night, that the answer would arrive in the form of her own departure, a choice that would cost her everything she had left, and finally, at long last, break through the last of Julian's careful restraint entirely. The weeks following the Dowager Duchess's death passed in a strange, muted haze, the household still adjusting to the absence of a woman who had, for so many years, been its quiet, steady heart. Eleanor found herself with fewer duties than before, the role that had defined so much of her daily life now gone, leaving her with long, empty hours she did not know how to fill, and far too much time to turn over, again and again, the words she and Julian had finally spoken to each other in the garden. She had not seen him alone since that night. Whether by his design, or her own careful avoidance, or perhaps some unspoken agreement between them both, they had not found themselves in a private moment together since the truth had finally been spoken aloud, and Eleanor was uncertain, in the days that followed, whether this distance was a mercy or simply one more quiet form of suffering they had both chosen to endure. It was her mother who finally gave voice to what Eleanor had already begun, in some private corner of her heart, to understand was inevitable. "You cannot stay here forever, Eleanor," her mother said one evening, as they sat together in the small room they had shared for so many years. "Not now. Not after everything." "I know," Eleanor said quietly. "There is a position," her mother continued carefully, "in Bath. A respectable family, in need of a companion for their eldest daughter, who is soon to make her own way in society. It pays well, and the family is known to be kind. I have made some inquiries on your behalf, without your knowledge, I confess, because I feared that if I waited for you to seek such a position yourself, you never would." Eleanor felt a fresh wave of grief rise in her chest, though she knew, even as it rose, that her mother was right. "I think," her mother said gently, taking her daughter's hand, "that you have spent 9 years of your life loving a man you can never have, in a house that will never truly be your own, no matter how faithfully you serve it. I think you deserve, at last, a chance to build a life that belongs entirely to you, Eleanor. Not a life spent in the shadow of someone else's household, however kind that household may have been to us both." Eleanor could not argue with the truth of this, though the thought of leaving Brantmere Hall, of leaving Julian, however impossible their love had always been, felt like being asked to tear away a piece of her own heart. But she thought, too, of the promise she had made to Cordelia, of the quiet dignity with which Julian's wife had asked only for the family's honor to remain intact, and she understood, with a painful clarity, that remaining at Brantmere Hall, carrying 9 years of unspoken love now finally spoken aloud, would only make that promise harder and harder to keep with each passing year. She wrote to accept the position in Bath within the week, and arrangements were made for her departure the following month, a decision she shared with no one beyond her mother and the household steward, wishing to avoid, for as long as possible, the difficult conversation she knew she would eventually need to have with Julian himself. Word of her departure reached him, in the end, not through any conversation Eleanor had planned, but through the ordinary gossip of the household, passed along by servants who noticed the trunks being packed in her small room, and by the time Julian sought her out directly, only 2 days remained before her scheduled departure. He found her in the library, late in the evening, the same room where their story had first quietly begun so many years before, and Eleanor, seeing his face, understood immediately that he already knew. "You're leaving," he said, his voice carefully controlled, though she could see the effort it cost him to keep it that way. "Yes," Eleanor said softly, "in 2 days' time. Without telling me." "I was going to tell you," she said, though even as she spoke the words, she understood how weak they must sound. "I simply did not know how." Julian crossed the room slowly, stopping a careful distance away, though his eyes never left her face. "Is this because of what I said, that night in the garden? Because of what you said back to me?" "It's because of everything, Julian," Eleanor said, her voice breaking despite her best efforts to remain composed. "It's because I have loved you for 9 years, and I cannot spend the rest of my life loving you quietly, in the shadows of this house, watching you belong to someone else, waiting for stolen moments in gardens and libraries that only ever end in more pain for both of us." I made a promise, once, to your wife, that I would do nothing to bring scandal upon this family. Staying here, now that the truth has finally been spoken between us, feels like the surest way I know to eventually break that promise, whether I mean to or not. You spoke with Cordelia? Julian's voice carried genuine surprise. Years ago, Eleanor admitted. She knew, Julian. She has known for a long time. Longer, I think, than either of us realized. She asked only that we protect this family's honor, and I gave her my word. Leaving Brantmere is the only way I know to keep it. Julian was silent for a long moment, his jaw tight, his eyes bright with an emotion he seemed to be fighting with everything he had left. And what of my own honor? He said finally, his voice low and rough. In letting you walk away, after 9 years, without ever once fighting to keep you. There is nothing to fight for, Eleanor said gently, though the words tore at her heart even as she spoke them. You are married, Julian. Whatever we feel for each other, it cannot change that fact. It never could. He said nothing more that night, and Eleanor left the library first, unable to bear the weight of his silence a moment longer, though she carried the memory of his face, tight with barely restrained grief, with her, through every hour that remained before her departure. The morning of her leaving arrived gray and cold, fitting weather for the heaviness that sat in Eleanor's chest as she made her final preparations, saying quiet goodbyes to the household staff who had become, over so many years, something like a family to her. Her mother had chosen to remain at Brantmere Hall for the time being, unwilling to give up the security of her own long-held position, though she promised to write often, and to visit when circumstance allowed. Eleanor did not see Julian that morning, and she told herself, as the carriage was loaded with her trunks, that this was likely for the best, that a final goodbye between them would only make the departure harder to bear for them both. She climbed into the carriage, with a heaviness in her chest that felt almost unbearable, and as the vehicle began its slow journey down the long drive, away from the only home she had truly known since childhood, she allowed herself, finally, to weep, quietly, into her gloved hands, mourning not only the man she had loved for 9 years, but the entire life she was leaving behind along with him. She did not know that Julian, informed only moments earlier by a breathless servant that her carriage had already begun its departure, was even then abandoning every careful restraint he had maintained for 9 long years, running from the house, with no thought for dignity or propriety, his heart pounding, with a desperate, singular need to reach her before it was too late. The carriage had not yet reached the end of the long drive when Eleanor heard, faintly at first, then unmistakably, the sound of someone shouting her name. She turned, startled, and through the carriage window saw Julian running across the frosted lawn, his coat forgotten, his composed dignity abandoned entirely, running as though nothing in the world mattered more than reaching her before the carriage passed beyond the gates. She called for the driver to stop, her heart pounding, and by the time the carriage had fully halted, Julian had reached it, breathless, his face flushed with cold and exertion, and an emotion so raw and unguarded that Eleanor felt something in her own chest finally, completely, shatter at the sight of it. "Don't go," he said, his voice breaking as he reached the carriage door. His hand pressed against it, as though he could hold the entire vehicle in place through sheer force of will alone. "Please, Eleanor. 9 years. 9 years I have told myself that duty mattered more than my own heart, that loving you quietly, from a distance, was a sacrifice I could bear for the sake of everyone around me. But watching that carriage pull away just now, I understood, in a single terrible moment, that I cannot bear it any longer. I would rather lose everything, my title, my honor, the good opinion of every soul in this county, than lose you, without ever once fighting to keep you." Eleanor stepped down from the carriage, her legs unsteady beneath her, tears streaming freely down her face. "Julian, you cannot simply abandon everything you've built, everything you owe to this family." "I am not abandoning anything," he said, taking her hands in his own trembling with the force of 9 years finally breaking free. "Cordelia and I have spoken, Eleanor, at length, in the days since my mother's passing. Our marriage has never been one of love, and we have both known it since the beginning. She has agreed, given everything she has witnessed over the years, to seek a quiet separation, conducted with as much discretion and dignity as such a thing can be managed. It will take time, and there will be difficulties, and I will not pretend otherwise, but I am done, Eleanor. Spending my life protecting a duty that has only ever brought both of us pain, while the one thing that has ever truly made me happy stands within my reach, and I am too afraid to take it." Eleanor could hardly breathe, hardly believe the words she was hearing, after 9 long years of careful, quiet restraint. "Are you certain?" she whispered. "Truly certain, Julian, because I could not bear it. If this proved to be only the grief of losing your mother speaking, and not your own true heart." "I have never been more certain of anything in my life," he said, and the raw honesty in his voice left no room for doubt. "I loved you when I was 12 years old, sitting with you in the dirt behind the stables, though I did not yet understand what that feeling meant. I have loved you every single day since. Through every year I told myself I could not have you. Through every stolen moment I convinced myself meant nothing more than old friendship. I am done pretending otherwise, Eleanor. I am done letting duty decide what my heart is allowed to want." Eleanor let out a sound that was half sob, half laughter. 9 years of grief and longing, finally breaking free all at once. And when Julian pulled her into his arms, right there on the frosted drive, in full view of the house, and anyone who cared to watch, she did not pull away, did not think of propriety or scandal, or anything at all beyond the simple, overwhelming relief of finally being held by the man she had loved in secret for nearly her entire life. "I am not asking you to stay today," Julian said finally, drawing back just enough to look into her eyes, his hands still cradling her face with a tenderness 9 years of restraint had never once allowed him to show. "There will be difficulties ahead, arrangements to be made, time that must pass before either of us can act with the freedom we both deserve. But I am asking you to wait, Eleanor, to trust that I will come for you properly, with my honor intact and my house finally set right, and that when I do, it will be to ask you to become my wife, not my secret, not my shadow, but my Duchess, in full view of the entire world." Eleanor pressed her hand against his, tears still falling, though now they fell with a joy so profound it nearly frightened her after so many years of grief. "I have waited 9 years, Julian," she said softly. "I think I can manage to wait a little longer, now that I finally know what I am waiting for." He kissed her then, gently, carefully, as though 9 years of restraint had taught him, at last, exactly how precious such a moment truly was. And when they finally parted, both of them breathless, both of them changed forever by the truth they had finally allowed themselves to speak, Eleanor understood that whatever difficulties still lay ahead, she was no longer walking into them alone. She did travel to Bath that day, as planned, though the parting now carried an entirely different weight, a temporary separation rather than a final farewell. And in the months that followed, Julian's letters arrived faithfully, filled with news of the slow, careful arrangements being made to formally dissolve a marriage that had never truly been a marriage of hearts, conducted always with the dignity and discretion that both he and Cordelia, in the end, managed to extend toward each other despite everything. It took the better part of a year before Julian arrived in Bath himself, standing at Eleanor's door with the same raw, unguarded expression he had worn on the frosted drive at Brantmere Hall, a small velvet box held carefully in his hands, and when he asked her, finally, properly, in full view of the world, to become his wife, Eleanor understood that 9 years of secret love had, at last, found its way into the light. They were married the following spring, at Brantmere Hall itself, in a ceremony far smaller and quieter than the grand affair that had once joined Julian to Cordelia, but far richer, Eleanor thought, in the simple truth of the love it celebrated. Cordelia herself, remarried by then to a widowed gentleman she had come to genuinely care for, sent her sincere congratulations, a final act of grace that Eleanor never forgot. Standing in the same garden where Julian had once run to stop her carriage, now dressed in her wedding finery instead of her traveling clothes, Eleanor looked up at the man she had loved in secret for 9 long years, now finally, truly, entirely her own, and understood that some loves, however long they must wait, however much silence they must endure, are worth every single year of the waiting, if only for the chance to finally, truly, be spoken aloud. The first months of their marriage settled over Brantmere Hall like a season the house itself had been quietly waiting for. Eleanor moved through the same corridors she had walked as a companion, as a servant's daughter, as a woman who had learned to make herself small so that her feelings would never be noticed, and found, to her quiet astonishment, that the rooms looked different now. The library no longer felt like a place to hide. The garden gate no longer felt like a boundary she could approach but never cross. She was mistress of the house that had once given her only a narrow, careful corner to call her own, and there were mornings she woke beside Julian and simply lay still for a moment, listening to him breathe, half convinced she would open her eyes and find herself 18 again, waiting outside a door for a life that would never be hers. The household staff, many of whom had known her since she was a grieving 11-year-old girl fresh from her father's funeral, received her new position with a warmth that surprised her. The housekeeper who had once trained her in the management of linens now curtsied to her as Duchess, and though Eleanor insisted, gently but firmly, that such formality was unnecessary between old friends, she understood that some changes could not be undone by wishing alone. She was careful, in those early months, to walk the line between the woman she had always been and the position she now held, never forgetting the kitchens, the tenants, the small kindnesses that had once been shown to a frightened girl with nothing to her name. Margaret, delighted beyond measure at the marriage, took to visiting often, bringing with her, in time, a husband of her own, and then children, who filled the halls of Brantmere with a noise and laughter the old house had not heard in years. Eleanor adored them instantly, and found in their visits a particular joy she had not expected, watching Julian, once so careful and controlled, kneel on the nursery floor to build towers of wooden blocks with his young nephews, the same unguarded warmth in his face that she remembered from the boy who had once sat beside her in the dirt behind the stables. There were difficulties, of course, as Julian had warned her there would be. Certain corners of society were slow to forgive what they considered an irregular arrangement. Whispered comparisons between the steward's daughter and the well-born duchess she had replaced, following him through drawing rooms for longer than either of them would have liked. Eleanor bore these small cruelties with the same quiet dignity she had carried through 9 years of silence, and found, more often than not, that her steadiness in the face of gossip won her more respect than the gossip itself ever cost her. Julian, for his part, never once allowed a slight against his wife to pass unanswered, and there was a particular satisfaction, Eleanor found, in watching a man who had spent so many years guarding his every word, now speak plainly and without hesitation in her defense. Word came, 2 years into their marriage, that Cordelia had been safely delivered of a daughter in her new marriage, and Eleanor wrote to her at once, a warm and sincere letter of congratulations that carried no trace of old rivalry, only genuine gladness for a woman who had shown her, in the end, more grace than the world had any right to expect. Cordelia's reply, when it came, was equally warm, and the two women maintained, for the rest of their lives, a quiet correspondence, built not on friendship exactly, but on a mutual respect earned through years of shared, difficult honesty. Eleanor's mother lived to see her daughter settled at last, spending her final years comfortably at Brantmere Hall, doted upon by both Julian and Eleanor in a manner that more than repaid whatever hardship she had endured raising a daughter alone after her husband's death. She often said, in her last years, that she had never imagined, on the cold morning she brought her grieving 11-year-old girl through the gates of Brantmere Hall for the first time, that the same gates would one day welcome that girl home, not as a servant's daughter, but as its duchess. In the years that followed, Eleanor and Julian had children of their own, 2 sons and a daughter, each of them raised with the same freedom Julian had never quite been permitted himself, encouraged to speak their hearts plainly, rather than burying them beneath the weight of duty. Eleanor made certain of this, more than anything else, determined that no child of hers would ever spend 9 years loving someone in silence, certain that the truth of their heart was a thing that had to be hidden away for the sake of everyone else's comfort. When Julian's eldest son once asked him, many years later, how he had come to marry his mother, Julian answered without hesitation, in front of the whole family gathered at the long dinner table, that he had loved her since he was 12 years old, and that the only true mistake of his life had been waiting 9 long years to say so aloud. Eleanor, listening from across the table, felt her eyes fill with the same old tears, though now, at last, they fell only for joy, and she reached for his hand beneath the table, the way she had once reached for it in the dark of a library long ago, no longer needing to hide, no longer needing to let go before anyone could see. She thought, often, in the quiet contentment of her later years, of the frightened girl who had once stood in a dark hallway, certain that love above her station could only ever end in ruin, and she was glad, every single day, that the girl had been brave enough and patient enough to keep loving anyway.